The religious upheaval, the revolution in theology, if you will, that gave birth to the various Christian sects in the 16th century was matched, as you know so well, by a veritable revolution in the Catholic Church, which we refer to as the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. Pope Paul III, whose pontificate lasted from 1534 until 1549, really began the work that would ultimately be the Counter-Reformation by appointing very virtuous and very learned men to high church offices. By summoning the Council of Trent, of course, his policies were continued. Pope Paul IV brought this magnificent council to a successful conclusion with the help of St. Charles Borromeo, whose feast you know well, I think we are keeping today, with the help of Borromeo and others. And Pope St. Pius V was the man who put the conciliar decrees into force and really began a movement that led to the reestablishment of the faith in many, many parts of Europe. Now, during the many trials the church endured during these years, she was also strengthened by the formation of new religious orders, not the least of which was the Society of Jesus, begun by St. Ignatius Loyola in 1634. The Jesuits were to do tremendous work preserving the faith in southern Europe and checking the spread of Protestantism in the north, most especially by the magnificent university system that the Jesuits set up and established throughout all of Western Europe. The Jesuits were the great defenders of faith in the 16th century, and the Jesuit universities that popped up all over Western Europe were literally citadels of Catholic teaching. It was quite a magnificent thing that was in existence some centuries ago. Other groups, such as the Capuchins, the Congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, the Oblates of St. Charles Borromeo, all contributed special kinds of services to the reform of the church. And at the same time, many of the older orders, the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, that had by now been in existence for some centuries, with very much renewed zeal and devotion, preached the word and the example of Christian life, not only to their fellow Europeans, but indeed these religious orders went well beyond the confines of Western Europe with the tremendous resurgence of Catholic missionary activity that one saw as the 16th century went on. So, with this very, very general kind of a background as to what was going on at the time, the very general background to the decades that followed the initial impact of the Reformation, we want to look now in just a little bit of detail on how the Counter-Reformation, how these marvelous events of the Catholic Reformation affected England. Remember, England was, of course, one of the great geographic centers of the Reformation. It started, as we all know so well, during the reign of King Henry VIII, following his official break from Rome and his self-proclamation as head of the church in England. Henry was succeeded, as many of you know, by his young Protestant son, Edward VI, who came to the throne at the advanced, ripe old age of 9 years of age. Needless to say, the government was much in the hands of the Privy Council. This young boy's 6-year reign, he died very, very young at the age of 15, but his 6-year reign was followed by the 9-day excursion into power of Lady Jane Grey. And following 9 days of Lady Jane Grey, finally came to the throne Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first and only legitimate wife, Catherine of Aragon. Bloody Mary, as she became known, surrounded herself with a number of very zealous Catholic advisors, and she attempted to enforce the wholesale conversion of England. Many, many Protestants, tragically, lay and clerical, ministers and bishops, were burned at the stake, and the country was plunged into a bloodbath. Well, of course, this only rallied so many, many Englishmen to the cause of Protestantism all the more. Mary herself had a very unhappy life. She was married, as I'm sure some of you know, to Philip II of Spain. And after only 14 months on the throne, Philip returned to his native land, and Mary herself lived rather unhappily for a few brief years, dying in Lambeth Palace in 1558. Now, in November of that very same year, shortly after Mary's death, her unmarried half-sister, Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII with his second wife, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I entered the city of London, November 1558. Her welcome into the city of London was somewhat muted, and her entry into the city had to be very carefully managed to give the impression that there was great popular enthusiasm for her coming. There wasn't quite as much popular enthusiasm as one would be led to think, but the enthusiasm can be manufactured oftentimes, and some of it was manufactured when Elizabeth made her triumphant entry into the city of London. Most Protestant zealots saw Elizabeth as their savior. And though she certainly never fulfilled the most extravagant hopes of some of her great admirers, it does seem that at the outset she was very much committed to reversing the religious policies of her half-sister Mary. And if we follow along her 44-year reign, you will see the beginning penal enactments and then the increasingly harsher penal enactments, and all of them put together are proof positive where the sentiments of Elizabeth I really were. Now, a valid question I think we have to ask this evening, as we begin the reign of Elizabeth I in England, the period of time, the lengthy period of time where the Counter-Reformation really took place in England. As we begin Elizabeth's reign, a valid question to ask is this: to what extent had Catholicism survived in England since the time of Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, and his initial break from Rome? Remember, several decades had now gone by. A couple of decades, rather, had gone by since the 1530s. We're now up to 1558. One British historian by the name of Alan Durham attempts to answer the question about the survival of Catholicism in England at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, and this is what he writes. It is not simply the lack of detailed evidence which makes it impossible to give accurate estimates of Catholic strength in 1558. The very definition of Catholicism is difficult, for it covers a wide spectrum of opinion. Various strains of Catholicism can be identified. There were, for instance, those who adhered to medieval Catholic rituals and rites out of a sense of deep conservatism. Secondly, there were those whose adherence to the old faith was more articulate, perhaps under the influence of Catholic literature from the continent, or the Marian priests, that would be the priests ordained during Mary's reign, but who nevertheless attended the Anglican Church. They had no choice, really. These people who professed the Catholic faith, but nonetheless attended the Anglican Church, are individuals that were referred to, and are still historically referred to, as church papists. In other words, they were there, but they really were not there. Durham continues, thirdly, there were the recusants, a term applied to Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services, and also to those Catholics who refused the oath of supremacy out of a belief in papal supremacy. There is little evidence in 1558 for strong support for papal leadership, which is hardly surprising, as England had been in schism since 1534, except for Mary's brief reign. But, this historian concludes, but if we use Catholic in its widest sense, we find plenty of evidence of strong survival, especially in certain parts of the country. So if you look at the certain parts of the country that this historian is talking about, first of all, we have to go to the north, to great old Catholic Lancashire. The faith flourished there for a variety of reasons. The Anglican Church in the north was weak, and it was poorly endowed. Marian priests, as we say, those who were ordained during Mary's reign, deprived of office, or priests who had resigned after the year 1558, were very actively working, spreading the faith in the north of England. Geographic factors come into the picture as well. Lancashire was, and still is to this day, a several-hour train ride from the city of London. So they were far removed up in Lancashire, and Catholics could, to a certain extent, live there in peace. It's a very beautiful section of England. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. I remember very well taking a ride just from the train station in Preston one time out to Stonyhurst College to visit that famous Jesuit institution out there, and the very beautiful, beautiful scenery. Preston, I was told at the time, is still the most Catholic city in England in terms of percentage of Catholics living there. So certainly Lancashire was one of the areas where there was strong Catholicism. Durham would be another example. Durham is on the border between England and Scotland, and because of its locale on the border, there were a lot of refugee Scottish priests who were able to come down and minister to the Catholics in Durham and to keep the faith alive. West Sussex was yet another example of a strong adherence to the old faith, despite some of the general Protestant sympathies of the southern and southeastern counties. Nonetheless, the faith survived in good measure in West Sussex. Many of the conservative Catholic aristocracy of those days thought that Catholicism was the natural religion, and the Elizabethan reforms were nothing more than an intrusion into that which was natural. In the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, Catholics suffered relatively mild penalties under the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity. For example, failure to attend the Anglican Church would result in a fine. Refusing to take the oath of supremacy meant a loss of office if there was a Catholic here or there who was still holding some kind of an office. Now, anyone who wrote or who spoke in favor of papal supremacy got 3 chances. If you were writing or speaking in favor of the supremacy of the Holy Father, you were given 3 chances. If they got you the first time, you would suffer a certain loss of your goods. In other words, they would confiscate some of your property. They would go and take some of your horses, I suppose, or whatever looked good to the local government officials. If they got you offending on a second occasion, what was applied to you was the ancient law of praemunire. That would be the forfeiture of all of your property and imprisonment. And then if they got you a third time, it was the death penalty. There was a less than strong papal leadership during this time, and the reason why there was in other words, there was not a strong leadership coming from Rome in defense of these Catholic people. Some of that was fostered by Philip II of Spain himself, Queen Mary's husband. But there was a general attitude at the Vatican that England could be won back to the true faith, to the ancient religion, by diplomacy. It didn't work. But that was the thinking in Rome at the time, and so there was very little done as far as exerting any pressure on the British government. In fact, Queen Elizabeth at one time was actually giving some thought to sending official representation to the Council of Trent. She thought, she would send some of her government leaders, at least as observers, because Queen Elizabeth was under the impression that there was going to be a free exchange of ideas at the Council of Trent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if any of you know the Council of Trent, it was not a council where we had the free exchange of ideas. It was a strongly dogmatic council in the Church's history, and the Holy Father asserted his authority in 1560. Elizabeth got the message. She got it very clearly, and hence there were no governmental representatives from England ever sent as observers or anything else to attend the Council of Trent. But given all of these things, we can certainly say now by 1560, the Counter or Catholic Reformation was really and truly starting. Again, to quote Alan Durays, he takes up the story and tells us how the Counter-Reformation was really starting. He writes, "The most vigorous Catholicism of these years was among the expatriates living on the continent, particularly at the University of Louvain in Belgium. The literary output of the exiles was remarkable. Their efforts helped to sustain the morale of English Catholics. And in 1565, someone in Elizabeth's government complained, 'The popish exiles are disturbing us, and they are giving us all the trouble in their power.'" Though many of the works that were being produced at Louvain were concerned with religious controversy, many others, he writes, were devotional works. Thomas Harding, among others, translated a number of Spanish writings into English, familiarizing English Catholics with some of the spiritual works of the Counter-Reformation. Some exiles were among the early advocates of using force to restore English Catholicism. But But, he concludes, a far more practical step, not using force, but a far more practical step, was the founding of a seminary at Douai in the Netherlands by William Allen, who was an exile at Louvain before returning to his native Lancashire. Now, William Allen is one of the central figures in the story of the Catholic Counter-Reformation in England. He was a marvelous man, a real defender of the faith. Allen was born in Lancashire, of course, in the year 1532. It was the same year Cranmer became Archbishop of Canterbury. And 2 years later, Cranmer, in cahoots with Henry VIII, had their official break from Rome. So William Allen would have been a young lad of just 2 years old, living up in the north of England, when Henry VIII actually separated himself from the Apostolic See of Rome. The young Allen went to Oxford, where he would witness some momentous changes in that university town in the course of his life. And curiously, when he went to Oxford, the college where he associated himself was the College of Oriel, or more properly, the College of Our Lady of Oriel. 3 centuries later, at that same College of Oriel, the great convert Cardinal John Henry Newman would bring a very distinct honor. Allen went on to take his M.A. at Oxford during Queen Mary's reign, and almost certainly he would have witnessed the burning of the Protestant martyrs at this time, as he also would see the decimation of everything Catholic just a few years later under Elizabeth. He managed to live at Oxford for 2 years during Elizabeth's reign, and he served as principal of St. Mary's Hall and as one of the proctors of the university. Ultimately, as the story goes with so many Catholics, he was forced to resign and leave the country, and he crossed over to Flanders in the year 1561, and he took refuge in the ancient university town of Louvain. Now, when he got to Louvain in Belgium, he found many devout Catholic refugees passionately committed to the restoration of the faith in their homeland. In fact, one of the things that really began to disturb William Allen, the young William Allen, the most, was what he described as his horror at the fact that Catholics had to attend services that were prescribed by the British Parliament. They had to attend the religious services of a sect to which they had never adhered. Believe it or not, strange as it may seem or sound, that was one of the reasons why the young William Allen decided to study for the Roman Catholic priesthood. It doesn't, on the outwardly anyway, it does not sound like the most spiritual of reason. It sounds like I just want to get back at them. But wanting to get back, in the case of this young man, had a very strong spiritual foundation. And so, he was ordained a priest in the city of Malines in Belgium in 1565, and 2 years later, he stayed living in Belgium, of course, and he was returning to Belgium from a pilgrimage in Rome. And on the way back from the pilgrimage, he began to discuss with very close friends of his who had traveled with him his very concrete plans for the opening of a seminary at the University of Douai. The seminary would be the English College. Now, it was a very strategic place to locate a Catholic seminary for the training of English priests. One British historian explains the reason why, and I will quote him. It was in the extreme southwest of the Netherlands, in a French-speaking area almost equidistant from Paris and Brussels. Though students occasionally traveled via Antwerp or Bruges, the natural route to England went through St. Omer to Calais, Gravelines, or Dunkirk. Moreover, in 1578, the revolt of the Netherlands forced the seminary from Douai over the border to Reims. You know, the Douai-Reims Bible, you've all heard of that? Here we go, the Douai-Reims Bible. So that between 1578 and 1590, the vast majority of priests came into England from French ports. Spain was only used on any scale after the outbreak of the final civil war in France in 1589. The Seminary at Valladolid was established in that same year, 89, and another seminary at Seville 3 years later, and that, of course, would reflect the growing importance of Spain for the English mission. Priests going from Spain to England often made use of intermediary ports such as Waterford and Cork in Ireland, or Nantes and La Rochelle in France. This account continues. Those using the Netherlands were likely to arrive in Hull, Newcastle, or other ports along the east coast. Consequently, reception places sprang up on that coast, such as Grossmont Priory near Whitby, a well-known shelter for priests in the 1580s and 90s. And priests who used Calais or Dunkirk would land it as a rule on the south coast and frequently made right for London. The sea route from Spain was never as popular as the other two, even in the 1590s, but when it was used, it landed priests in the south or the southwest at such ports as Chester for those arriving via Ireland. Close quotes. At the Council of Trent, Cardinal Reginald Pole was present. He was, of course, to become the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, as many of you know, I'm sure. And he was the chief instigator at the Council of Trent. He was the chief instigator of the regulation. He was the one who pushed, I should say, the most, the regulation that came out of the Council of Trent for the establishment of seminaries for the training of priests. The English College, established at Douai by Cardinal Allen, was the first seminary officially opened in response to this regulation, this decree that came down from the Council of Trent. It opened at Douai in 1568. And a few years after it opened, Pope Gregory XIII gave a very substantial financial gift that freed the college from a whole lot of dependence either on wealthy local Catholics or indeed wealthy English Catholics who had been funding it up to that time. By 1580, William Allen was reporting the ordination of some 20 students a year from the seminary, nearly all of whom were sent right to England. In 1575, out of 10 ordained, 3 became martyrs. In 1576, out of 11 ordained, 2 became martyrs. The following year, 1577, out of 24 men ordained, 7 were martyrs. And so the college diary continued year after year. Well, the Elizabethan government, of course, was now faced with an onslaught of these zealous priests coming from the English college at Douai, sneaking in through all these ports into England and doing their evangelizing work. And the Elizabethan government had to respond in kind. So, it was now made high treason, and I quote, to withdraw any of the Queen's subjects from the religion now by Her Highness's authority established and taking them over to the Romish religion. It was also made high treason, I quote again, to be willingly withdrawn as aforesaid or reconciled. To say or sing Mass was punished by a fine of 200 marks and imprisonment for a year. To hear or assist at Mass involved the same penalty, only the fine was only 100 marks if you got caught going to Mass. The penalties against the recusant families were at the same time increased. Well, at the end of the year 1575, Pope Gregory XIII summoned William Allen to Rome from Douai, and he wanted to talk to Dr. Allen, Father Allen, about the opening of a second seminary, in addition to the English College at Douai. But this time the Holy Father was interested in opening an English seminary in the city of Rome itself. And this is a particularly fascinating story. Fascinating for me because I spent 4 years of my life in Rome, and I know this particular institution very well. Remember, it's 1575. Now, 200 years earlier, back in the 1300s, there was a merchant by the name of John Shepherd, a very wealthy merchant in London. And Shepherd had established a hospice for English travelers, for English pilgrims going on pilgrimage to Rome. He established it on the Via Montserrat, where it still is to this day. By 1575, the year we're talking about, there were 8 priests who were living in this hospice, this house of hospitality, where all English pilgrims and travelers, by the way, could stay perfectly free. You did not have to pay if you were on religious pilgrimage and you were an Englishman going to Rome. So 8 priests were living there, and they were maintained by the charity which John Shepherd had established long ago. It was their task to look after the English pilgrims for however long they were going to stay. Well, due to the persecutions that were going on in England, the number of pilgrims going from England to Rome in these latter years, now the 16th century, were dwindling every year. And so the Holy Father, Gregory XIII, got the idea that he would take this house of hospitality, this hospice, and he would transform it into use as a seminary to train English students in the city of Rome. Dr. Allen was enormously enthusiastic about the idea, and he set to work with others to try to convert the building into its use as a seminary. It still maintained its hospitality, of course, for English pilgrims, but nonetheless, as a result of these deliberations, plans, work, and so forth, the Venerable English College came into being. And you can visit that Venerable English College on the Via Montserrat in Rome to this very, very day. Appropriately enough, William Allen lies buried in the chapel of that English college, the Venerabile, as it is so often referred to. And this Venerabile, this Venerable English College in Rome, was to have a glorious, glorious history over the centuries. And I read to you now one account from one history of the Venerable English College in Rome, written by one of its students. This is what he writes. The martyrdoms of our college students took place over a prolonged period, from St. Ralph Sherwin in 1581 to St. David Lewis in 1679. And the particular contexts in which their deaths took place changed somewhat as the years progressed. The period of greatest persecution and most martyrdoms was the latter part of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603. Catholicism was recognized as a real threat to the Elizabethan regime, particularly following the Northern Rising of 1569 and Pope St. Pius V's excommunication of Queen Elizabeth in 1570. The government responded to this threat with extreme measures. Under the so-called Statute of 27th Elizabeth of 1584, it became a crime of treason simply for any priest ordained abroad to return to English soil. And harboring a priest was likewise a crime punishable by death. The death penalty for treason meant being hanged, drawn, and quartered. In the words of the official sentence, drawn upon a hurdle to the place of execution, there hanged and cut down alive, dismembered, and your entrails burnt in your sight, then your head cut off, and your body to be divided in 4 parts. I'm sorry if it sounds gory to anyone. This is what people did for the faith. This account continues. While bloody, not even the Elizabethan persecutions were constant. Martyrdoms tended to be sporadic, triggered off by particular events, such as the Spanish Armada of 1588, in which year 4 of our college martyrs died. In the subsequent reigns of James I, Charles I, and Charles II, Catholics experienced prolonged periods of peace, interrupted by sudden violence. Again, persecution was triggered by general panic. A good example being the Titus Oates plot of 1679, in which an embittered ex-seminarian concocted an elaborate conspiracy theory resulting in a massive wave of anti-Catholic feeling. It will be noticed, the student writes, that many of our college martyrs died in the same year or even on the same day as one of these happenings, which gives a good impression of how the persecutions waxed and waned. With the death of St. David Lewis in 1679, the last of the 44 had shed their blood for Christ, and no further students of the college were called upon to suffer in such a way. Well, meanwhile, my friends, the exile of the English college at Rheims was to last some 15 years until they returned once again to Douay. In 1579, William Allen went once again to Rome in the hope of trying to find new manpower, priests who would come with him to England to continue the English mission. Now, he was training young men at Douay, he was training young men in Rome, but he still needed more. He needed all the priests he could get to come into England and to evangelize. Paul Kennedy, in his very fine work, The Catholic Church in England and Wales, notes that, and we quote him, "For 20 years, English Catholics had suffered bitter, grinding persecution. The chief result was an extraordinary increase in their fervor. Those who had clung to the Catholic faith, in spite of fines and imprisonment, were ever eager to receive the sacraments and to hear Mass. The old Marian priests had dwindled by death and imprisonment, and it was on the young seminary priests that the people relied for support. Allen had to find a new source." Close quotes. Well, that new source was to come in the person of the magnificent English Jesuits. With the help of Father Robert Parsons and Father Ralph Sherwin, the society deliberated before they finally agreed to Allen's request that they would indeed join his English mission. The success of the mission with the Jesuits reached such proportions that it provoked a proclamation by Elizabeth I ordering the recall of all students from the seminaries and the banishment of all Jesuits and seminary priests from England. Parents who had sons at the seminaries were ordered to recall them within 4 months under threat of severe penalties, and then to take them home and present them to the Protestant bishop. In response to the Queen's proclamation, William Allen wrote a book called Apology of the English Seminaries. It was thought to be the finest literary contribution that William Allen would make in the course of his life. He explained that if Catholics were allowed to practice the ancient religion, they would be only too quick to return to their native home. Not only was this basic right being denied them, he said, but Catholics were deprived of the sacraments that were necessary for their salvation, and they were forced to attend services they never gave their assent to. He went on to state that the exiles were not put in their present circumstance because of any crime of political disloyalty to the Queen. He then went on at some length to discuss the meaning and the purpose of the seminaries, including a splendid portion on the work of Catholic priests in consoling and strengthening the faithful and bringing back those who had lapsed. His book closes with a particularly beautiful passage on uniting one's sufferings to those of Christ. That was directed especially to his co-religionists who were enduring so very, very much. There is no question, none at all, that Allen's work was heightened at this period by the magnificent contribution of the English Jesuits under the leadership of Robert Parsons. The same historian, Kennedy, summarizes the life of Father Parsons in this way. Kennedy notes that Parsons, quote, was a fellow at Oxford. He left England and converted to Catholicism at Louvain, becoming a Jesuit in 1575. Along with Edmund Campion, Parsons led the first Jesuit mission in England in 1580, but he left for the continent after Campion's arrest. He continued his diplomatic activity in Rouen, France, on behalf of English Catholics, promoting for 20 years the Spanish invasion of England and formulating ideas about a Catholic successor to Elizabeth I. His most influential writing was the Christian Directory in 1582, an exhortation to the way of salvation by faith and good works. From 1597 until his death, this historian notes, Father Parsons was rector of the English College in Rome. Parsons was convinced that the organizational structure of the English mission had to be improved, and while he worked himself at sending many more recruits into England, the work of the English Jesuits really fell to two others, Robert Southwell and Henry Garnet. Southwell's task was to stay in London, in the city of London, to assist new arrivals, while Garnet went around the entire country strengthening Catholic faith. When the seminary priests would arrive in the city of London, Southwell would begin placing them in very secure homes. Southwell himself, of course, was captured, and after his capture, the leadership of the English mission fell to Henry Garnet, who continued the work of placement in the most secure of locales. Through the years, one of the most celebrated of these was a place called White Webb's at Enfield in Middlesex, which became a center of Catholic life. And another one was the very famous home called Stoner. Stoner is located near the city of Henley. As I recall, about an hour's train ride from London. You all know the Henley Regatta that's so famous over there every summer. You've heard of that for years, I imagine. Well, Stoner would be located very close to this town. And of all the various generations of the family who lived there, we remember in particular the magnificent work of Lady Cecily Stoner, who harbored scores of priests, the most famous of whom was Edmund Campion, the seditious Jesuit, as he's so often referred to. Edmund Campion came from a Catholic family who actually had conformed, to the established church sometime after 1558. He had a brilliant career at Oxford. He was very much favored at court. One time he got up and he gave an oration in the presence of the Queen. Well, the Queen took a very, very special shine to him. He was one of her favorite boys, so to speak. And he would have had a brilliant, brilliant career at court, just coming to her notice and coming under her protection, or her wing, if you will. He could have had a brilliant political career, there's no question about it. Some of his friends persuaded him to take orders in the Church of England. And he did. He took minor orders in the Church of England, but he did it with great hesitancy. And the reason he did it with such great hesitancy was because during Campion's younger days as an undergraduate at Oxford, what did he do? He began reading the Church Fathers. You can't read the Church Fathers and stay in the Church of England too long. It just doesn't work. I dare say there are people in this audience this evening who read the Church Fathers in great depth and probably had to leave their former religious conviction. We don't really know exactly when Edmund Campion formally was received back into the Catholic Church. He had, very clearly now, he had lapsed for a while. He probably was received back into the church when he arrived at Douay, because there was no doubt in his mind, A, that the Catholic Church was right, and B, that he wanted to study for the Catholic priesthood. So he goes to the English College at Douay. He presents himself to William Allen as a candidate for the seminary. Allen was overjoyed, one can imagine, but the joy did not last terribly, terribly long, because many people who were observing the young Edmund Campion thought, I wonder if this young man doesn't have a vocation to a monastic order. I wonder if he may leave and become a Benedictine or go into even a Carthusian, perhaps. He seemed to be called to that kind of holiness. Well, Campion surprised them all. He didn't stay at Douay, nor did he go into one of the older orders. He announced he was going to enter the Society of Jesus. It probably had to cause some kind of dismay to William Allen, who saw this very, very promising and very holy young man, but nonetheless, he acquiesced. Now, the Jesuits did not have a house in England at all at the time Edmund Campion wanted to enter them. He had to go to the continent, and he went to Prague, where he made his novitiate. He was not terribly impressed with Prague, I suppose because he walked down into the town square and saw this huge statue of John Huss, the reformer. I mean, now that would depress anyone. And it certainly depressed. The statue is still there. It's as depressing as ever if you visited Prague and you ever happen to see the statue of John Huss. In any event, he does not speak well of Prague, but he remained there and continued his Jesuit studies, was ordained to the priesthood. And it's interesting, when he left the Jesuit residence at Prague to undertake his missionary activity as a young Jesuit priest, his former novice master, we are told, in the Jesuit residence put a sign over the room that he occupied: Father Edmund Campion, martyr. You see, he knew all those years before. Well, he disguised himself as a young Irish servant boy, entered England, and he went to the counties of Berkshire, Oxfordshire, and Northamptonshire, where he made many, many converts. While he was decamped at Stoner Lodge, which, as we say, was near Henley, he wrote his very famous book, the Decem Rationis, 10 Reasons for Remaining a Catholic. Now, this thing circulated like wildfire. The first place that it got circulated was in the Church of Mary, or I think they call it St. Mary the Virgin, which is the University Church at Oxford. This book was printed, and it was printed, of course, at Stoner. There was a printing press right there, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies, beginning at Oxford and then going throughout the country of England. Edmund Campion was captured finally on July 15th, 1581, at Lyford, which is a place I know Marcus Grodi has visited. I have yet to get to Lyford. I'm still going to go and look at the sign. There's a sign there, I think, isn't there, indicating where he was. If Marcus and I ever run that trip together, we may do it one of these days. But in any event, he was captured in 1581. He was reading Mass on a Sunday morning, and there was a spy in the congregation. Well, he was taken, of course, to Newgate Prison in London. And not long after he was incarcerated, not only was the Decem Rationis being circulated, but a second book that he wrote called Campion's Brag. Campion's Brag began to appear. Campion's Brag was something that was a lot more intellectual in tone than the Decem Rationis. It was an appeal to the upper classes in British society for a fair hearing for his case for Catholicism. Well, time went on. And like so many priests, secular priests and Jesuit priests, Edmund Campion underwent the farce of a trial before being sentenced to death. Before dying, Campion was tortured beyond human endurance. Yet he never lost his peace of soul or his ability to respond to every question, every objection, and every insult that was thrown at him. He'd had a very, very strong intellectual training, and his interrogators were no match for him, and they knew it. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Edmund Campion came to him in death. Actually, it came to him on the day of his death, the day of his execution. They were marched from Newgate to the hill of Tyburn. I'm sure many of you visited Tyburn and the Convent of Perpetual Adoration, which is near the site of the Tyburn tree where so many of them died. There was a young man in the audience that day watching the whole thing as Campion was going to his death. The young man's name was Henry Walpole. Some decades ago, the famous convert Evelyn Waugh wrote a biography of St. Edmund Campion, and Evelyn Waugh in that book described the scene with Walpole sitting right in the front row to watch Campion's execution. This is what Evelyn Waugh writes. Speaking now of Henry Walpole, he was a typical member of that easygoing majority on whom the success of Elizabethan settlement depended, who would have preferred to live under a Catholic regime but accepted the change without very serious regret. He secured a front place at Tyburn, so close that when Campion's entrails were torn out by the butcher and thrown into the cauldron of boiling water, a spot of blood splashed upon his coat, on Walpole's coat. In that moment, writes Waugh, he was caught into a new life. He crossed the sea, became a priest, and 13 years later, after very terrible sufferings, he died the same death as Campion's on the gallows at York. St. Henry Walpole. Such then, my good friends, is a sampling, just a sampling, of the Counter-Reformation in England. It is the story of seminary foundation. It is the story of very, very zealous priestly work to convert, to bring back those who had lapsed, and to strengthen the most fervent of Catholic. It is the story of the dissemination of literature, the propagation of devotional tracts, all of this an apologia for the faith. And finally, the story of the Counter-Reformation in England is the story of heroic martyrdom, blood shed for Christ and his church. Our friend William Allen, by the way, was named a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church in 1587. He spent many years in Rome, laboring for the revision of the Vulgate Bible. He became the apostolic librarian. He participated in the election of 4 popes. And he had the fullest possible powers over all priests working in England as their ordinary, as their father, and even in some cases as their spiritual mentor. Catholics who were living abroad on the continent made numerous protestations of political loyalty to Queen Elizabeth I to very, very little avail. It would be years before conditions in the 16th century would change. Can we religiously suppose, John Henry Newman wrote in the Second Spring, can we religiously suppose that the blood of our martyrs 3 centuries ago and since shall never receive its recompense? My good friends, it receives its recompense every time a new convert comes into the church. No question about it. The blood of the martyrs truly is the seed of the church, and that planted seed has continued to grow throughout the church's history. Conversion to the true faith can never be separated from the intercession of those whose lives were given for the fullness of truth. May their intercession continue, especially through the magnificent contributions given to the church in our time by the Coming Home Network. God bless you, and God love you all.